Oh, yikes. It pops. Good morning, everybody. How are we all doing? Good. I got one response. One person's doing good.
I'm doing great.
Dad's doing great.
This, by the way, is a scripture reminder. Do not muzzle the ox that feeds you. This was the gift given to me this morning. Yeah, here we go.
I think we all deserve a round of applause. Give it to ourselves. We made it through the book of 1 Samuel yesterday. We're one book down. We got a lot more to go. But as we've been looking at the history of Israel, and we started off, and there were 4 parts of Israel's history. You can divide it into 4 major sections. Can someone give me the first one? Birth and development. That's the first one. Yeah, and as it says on our paper, that covers from creation to the introduction of Moses and what he did. Then there's the second stage, which is what we're in right now in our look through history. Can anyone give me the name of that one? Victory to expansion. Yeah, that's from Joshua, his conquest, the period of Judges, the time of the kings, and the united, divided kingdom, through King Solomon. Then we get the divided kingdom that starts the third part, which is called Decline and Defeat. That takes us through the divided kingdom time period all the way to the exile, when Babylonian comes in and takes out all the Jews from the kingdom of Judah. Then they start to come back, and that starts the fourth part, which is return and redemption. There we go. We're going to go over that every week because that's a great way to just divide up their history. Because the return, they come back from exile, they get reestablished as a nation, and that leads us all the way through to Jesus' coming, which is the redemption of not just Israel, but the redemption of the world as well. Now, as we go from there, we've been talking a lot about one person who was ruling Israel. Their first king, what was his name? King Saul. Now, he did a few bad things. There were 3 we talked about. The first 2 was his sacrifice, his impatience, not waiting for Samuel to come. Instead, he decided to sacrifice himself, even though that's not his job. He needs to be king, not the prophet. And then we also saw him breaking an oath he made before God after one of the battles. But there was one big event that caused him to be rejected by God as king. It was one of his biggest failure as his king. Does anyone remember what that failure was? Pride, but what was the event? He didn't kill his son. There was one really big one. It was about a nation. He did not kill the Amalekites, but he didn't wipe them out. That was what God told him to do. He didn't do it. He was rejected as king because he couldn't obey. He couldn't obey God, so he was rejected. And as we saw then, God chooses David. Saul tried to kill David. That was the rest of 1 Samuel, was Saul trying to kill David over and over and over. And at the end of last week, we saw the big differences between King Saul and what will become King David. There were 3 attitudes they had that were the exact opposite. What were the 3 things we described Saul as? He was prideful, fearful, and impatient. Yeah, those were the 3 things. That was his defining character we saw, was pride, fear, and impatience. And that's contrasted to David, who was, here are 3 words to describe him: humble, courageous, and patient. Yeah, we see David's patient as he refuses to kill Saul. And then last week, we saw the death of Saul. He was fighting against what nation? The Philistines, not quite. But while he was fighting the Philistines, Mom, this one's for you, David went and destroyed what nation? The ones that Saul was supposed to kill. So David finished what God wanted to get done, but I'm going to make an important note here because it'll come back later as we look at history. Because of Saul's failure, not every Amalekite was killed. David wiped out their nation, but because Saul didn't do it when God wanted him to, there were a few survivors here and there that survived the destruction of their people. One we'll see in the book of Esther, the bad guy of the book of Esther was a descendant of the Amalekites. So we see that because of Saul's failure, there are lasting consequences. And this week we're starting the book of 2 Samuel, and it starts with David. Again, because, David comes back after his destruction of the Amalekite people. He's back at his city, everything's going great. And all of a sudden, somebody from the battlefield where Saul was, comes before him and delivers terrible news. He says, "Saul is dead. I've brought you his crown and his armband." And David hears this and he starts to ask questions. And I'm going to read for us 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 5 through 10. It says, "Then David said to the young man who brought him this report, 'How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?' He says, 'I'd happened to be on Mount Gilboa,' the young man said, 'and there Saul was leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, "What can I do?" He asked me, "Who are you?" And the man responds, "An Amalekite." So here we have one of those survivors, because remember I said not all the Amalekites were dead? This guy was one of those Amalekites. He says, "I'm an Amalekite." Then he said to me, "Stand over and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but am still alive." So I stood over him and killed him, and I knew after he had fallen he could not survive. I took the crown that was on his head and brought the band on his arm and have brought them here before you, my Lord." So this Amalekite saw Saul, who was already fallen on his sword and almost dead. He wasn't quite dead yet. It's kind of like the Monty Python, I'm not dead yet. Saul wasn't quite dead yet, but he was dying, and he didn't want the Philistines to kill him. So he asked this Amalekite, which ironically, the people he should have killed, one of them now kills him on the battlefield. He reports this to David, and David gets mad. Because as we see, he says, "How dare you raise your hand against the Lord's anointed? You think this is a good thing that you have done?" And he orders his men that are with him to strike down the person who brought him the news. So they do. Because again, we see David knows who's supposed to be in charge. This was the Lord's anointed. How dare you touch the Lord's anointed? Remember what he always said whenever he had the opportunity? "I can't kill him. God anointed him." Now somebody had. And as we continue to look through that first chapter there, we see he begins to sing a song of lament for Saul and Jonathan. Again, we see David's character here, one of just reverence for God because he knew Saul was God's anointed king. He sang a song of lament over Saul's death because he didn't want Saul to die. Saul was his family. Jonathan was his family. He was sad to hear about their death. But as we continue from there, David returns home to Judah. And we're going to read it in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. It says, "In the course of time, David inquired the Lord." So now, some time has passed since he heard the news, and he asks the Lord. He says, "Shall I go up to the towns of Judah?" The Lord said to him, "Go up." Then David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. So David went there with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. Remember, we talked about her last week. Every time you see her name, it's going to be followed with the widow of the Nabal or Nabal's widow, a way to remember that she was there because her husband died because he refused to help David. David also took the men who were with him, each with their family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. When David was told that it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to them and said, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you the kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the house of Judah has made me king over them." We're going to take a pause there. So now we see David anointed as king. But when we hear that, anointed as king over Judah. Because while David was doing this, we get another story of Abner. And for all of us, this is a new name. Abner was Saul's main general, his commander of the army. This was Abner. And Abner, after the battle, runs back to Saul's home and gets one of Saul's living sons, Ishbosheth, and takes him and anoints him king over Israel. Because Abner doesn't know what's going on, but he knows the king's son, one of the last surviving ones, should be the next king. So now we have two kings anointed. We have David, God's chosen king, anointed king over Judah, and we have Ishbosheth, the anointed king over Israel. So this starts a 2-year war between Judah and the rest of Israel. This is a kind of, in my mind, a little foreshadowing to what we're going to see later when the kingdom divides. Because all of Israel, mainly the tribe of Benjamin and all its allies, side with Saul's son, whereas the tribe of Judah sides with David. That's the person that should be king. And they go to war. And as they go to war, it says they meet on the field of battle, and there are two big armies. And as we know, nobody likes to fight full battles. We see that. And this happened a lot in history, especially at this time. You would get your champions to fight, like David and Goliath. You know, you'd get your champions to fight each other. So you have the army of David, led by a man named Joab and his 2 brothers. And you have the armies of Ishbosheth, which is the rest of Israel. And they go to fight, and they all know each other. They're all kin, you know, they're all related. They're the same people. So they get together and say, we're going to get 12 people, and they're going to fight each other. And then the winner of that is the winner of the battle. You know, a nice way to solve your fights. Instead of having hundreds of people die, only 12 will die. So it says they begin to fight, these 12 people fight, and the people of David, they win that fight. Okay, all right. Just so I'll back it up. David is king of Judah. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, is the king of Israel. They are divided at this point because Judah wants David, the rest of Israel wants Saul's son. So they've gone to war about this. And you have Abner, the commander of Ishbosheth's army, and you have Joab, the commander of David's army. They are fighting on the field. David's men win the fight. All right, so now all of Ishbosheth's army are running away. And as they're running, Abner is running away from Joab's brother. And he knows him because it says he calls out his name as they're running away and says, turn to the right or left, fight somebody else. Why are you chasing me? So he knows who's chasing him. He knows them. They know each other. And as they're running, the guy calls back. He says, no, I'm going to kill you. That's what he says. So in an act of desperation, it says Abner pushes his spear backwards, and it goes through the man's chest. Not the sharp end, the blunt end. They were running so fast, the man impaled himself on the spear, then dies. And now we have an issue. Because in the law, it says an eye for an eye. So now Abner has killed Joab's brother. And now Joab, according to the law, is able to kill Abner because of this. An eye for an eye. That was the Jewish law. And if we go back and look at the law, that's why you had these cities of refuge, where people who had done something could hide in this city until a judge determined it was an accident or on purpose. Because if not, say I have my brother Andrew. Say somebody kills Andrew, my brother. According to the law, I can now kill them. Because they have killed one of my family members, I can kill them or their brother. That's what the law said. So Joab, now angry because his brother has fallen, begins to chase them even harder. And it says they get to a point where the day ends and they call out and say, why are we still killing each other? Let's both go home. So they both go home and then the fight's over. Now time continues to pass and Abner returns back to his home. And we see this at the beginning of chapter 3. Abner returns home where he gets in trouble because Ishbosheth, he takes all of his father's concubines and everything like that, and he says Abner was having an affair with one of Saul's concubines. So now Abner gets mad, and he says, "How dare you accuse me of this? Have I not been loyal to you? What are you doing? I'm your biggest general. Why are you accusing me?" And it says he makes a vow. He says, "I vow to this day, God strike me down if I do not do for David what God has promised him." So now, Saul's son, the commander of his army, Abner, goes over to David's side. He changes teams. He defects. He says, "You don't want me anymore. That's fine. I'll go help King David." So it says he goes to make his way to Hebron, where David is leading. But before he does that, he goes around to every tribe of Israel. And he starts to tell them, David is supposed to be king. God has anointed David over Israel. We need to support David. We need to be on David's team. Abner goes around and gets all of Israel to change teams to King David's side. And it says, as he does this, he even gets the tribe of Benjamin. So the whole tribe, Saul's whole tribe, decides to help David now. So he gets to David and he says, "All right, we need to meet up." And David's like, "Okay, we can meet, but I want you to bring me Michal." Remember David's first wife, Saul's daughter? Well, as I said, I believe I said it last week, she was married off to somebody else when Saul was trying to kill David. Well, now David wants her back because that's his wife. So it's just a short little story, but Abner goes and he gets Michal and he starts to bring her to David. And it says her current husband follows them the whole way, begging to get her back the whole time. So it's a really interesting story here. I find it kind of hilarious because you got this time of war and division, and now David wants his wife back. So this guy's crying to get his wife back because he's been married to her a long time now. The whole time David's been on the run, this has been his wife. Now all of a sudden, David wants her back. So he's crying, and as he's following them, it says, Abner turns to him and says, "Go home, get out of here." And the man does, all sad and depressed like, returns home. Now David meets up, he gets his first wife back, and hears that all of Israel's going to support him. And he's happy about this because he doesn't like killing his own people. As you can imagine, it's not nice to have a civil war. I mean, we had one in America, and it still holds the highest death count of any war because both sides, Americans died. So at this time, anyone who died in this war was an Israelite, was a Jew, was a Hebrew. It was God's people killing each other. So David's excited about this. It says he hosts a feast to celebrate Abner's coming to his side. And he tells them, "Go in peace and get everyone ready for battle again." So Abner leaves. And as he leaves, Joab comes back. Yeah, remember, Joab wants to kill Abner because of revenge for his brother. So Abner leaves in peace. Joab comes back to the city after a raid and hears from all the people around, Abner was here and David let him go in peace. And he gets outraged by this. He gets so mad, he goes to David and says, "How could you do this? Don't you know he's playing you? He's not actually on our side. He doesn't want to help us. He's our enemy. Why did you not kill him?" And David just dismisses this because he's like, "Listen, he's on our side. He's one of our guys." Joab's mad. It says he goes off in secret and sends a letter to get Abner to come back to Hebron. He sends a letter saying, I don't know what he said. He probably said something along the lines of, "King David says he wants you to return back to the town. He needs to tell you something." So Abner, being a good guy now, comes back to town. And when he does, it says Joab takes him around the shoulder and they go off into a quiet room like they were going to tell something in secret. And once they get there, Joab pulls out a sword and kills Abner inside the city. Again, we see the horribleness of the law, an eye for an eye, because now more people have died for no good reason. And after we get to that, as we look at towards the end of 2 Samuel 3, we're going to read verses 39 down through 35 to 39. This is David's response, because he hears Abner has been killed and is sad. He mourns again the death of Abner. And at the very end of the chapter, he says this, Then they came to David and urged him to eat something while it was still the daytime. Because he was in mourning, he was fasting. It even says David walked with the casket. The king of Israel, the king of Judah, King David, walked with the casket as they went to bury Abner. That's how upset he was over his death. And everyone came to get him to eat something, and he said to them, "May God deal with me ever so severe if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets." He's in such great mourning, he's fasting. And it says, at this, all the people took note and were pleased. Everything the king did pleased them. So on that day, all the people and all Israel knew the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner. Then the king said to his men, "Do you not realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am anointed king, I am weak. And these sons of Zeruiah, which are Joab and his brother, are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." Again, we see David mourning the death of Abner, and in so doing, it shows all of Israel that David is the guy you need to follow. So David still gets the support of the people, and also I love his last thing where he says, "May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." Even now, David is being patient and waiting for the Lord. He says, "I'm too weak to fight them. They are my commanders. I'm not going to be able to fight them. But you know who will? God. And God will repay the evildoers according to their deeds." He knew that the Lord is vengeful and just and full of wrath for evil people. So he was going to wait for the Lord to avenge the death of Abner. And as we continue from there, we get to the end of their war. And wouldn't you believe the end of this war ends in a pretty subtle way. It says Ishbosheth, the king, Saul's son, is in bed. He's gone to sleep. And while he's sleeping, his commanders, his own generals now, the people who he has in charge of his soldiers, come back to town, and they realize he's asleep right now. And they also realize we're alone in this fight. All of Israel has gone over to help David. All of Benjamin, our own tribe, has gone to help David. So we should just go over and help David. But instead of just leaving, it says they go into the house while he sleeps, and it says they look like they're going to go get wheat to make bread, but instead they go to the king's bedroom, they pull out their sword, they stab him in the stomach, and then cut off his head. And then they leave to go to David. So now they go to David, who's ruling at Hebron, and they bring him the head of his enemy. And they get there, and they're all excited to tell him the news. They get up to him, they say, "Listen, David, we're on your side now. Here's the head of Ishbosheth. Here it is. We killed him. You're king. Yay." And then David responds to him. And his response is, again, something that you wouldn't expect. But we're going to read it in chapter 4, verse 7. He says, chapter 4, verse 8. Verse 9. David answered them, the sons of Rimmon, and says, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of all the trouble." So he's like, God who delivered me out of trouble. "When the man told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death. That was his reward for his news." So he tells them, "Listen, last person to tell me that they killed the king, I killed them for it." Now he says, "How much more then will wicked men who have killed an innocent man in his own house, in his own bed, should I now not demand blood from you and rid you of this earth?" So he says, yeah, the last person who told me we killed the king, yay, you're good to be king now, I killed them. Now how much more will my vengeance be upon you, who not only killed an innocent man, but did it while he was sleeping? It's kind of like that old thing, you're not even man enough to fight him while he's awake. You waited for him to go to sleep. It's this wicked thing you have done. So he says he orders his men to come in and put them to death too. So again, we see David's kind of moral code is, listen, you do bad things, you're going to be killed. That's what the law says. He's doing his job as king, which is to make sure people follow the law. Because if we remember, there are the three parts, the king, the priest, and the prophet. David's role as king is to make sure the law gets followed and people are living holy. So that's what he's doing here. He says, you're doing these evil deeds, well, you're going to be put to death for it, because that is what happens. So now, the board is cleared. David is anointed king over all of Israel now. He is their king, and now it comes time for him to pick the place for the capital city. Do you have a question, Mama? Oh, okay. Yeah, because hands and feet of the evildoer. Like, we're going to get to it later, but Mom mentioned this. They cut off his hands and feet. And the reason they do a lot of that is hands and feet that have done evil things. If we remember the story of Jezebel, which we'll see later, whenever she dies, dogs come and they eat everything but the hands and the feet. Because she was so wicked, not even dogs wanted to touch that part, because she had done such horrible things. So the idea of hands and feet is the hands and the feet that do bad things. It's one of those kind of things. But now we have David picking his place for capital, the capital city. And he knows of the city of Jerusalem, on the hill of Zion. You know, this is a big city in the day, but it's not owned by the Israelites yet. It's owned by the Jebusites, named for where they live, Jerusalem. It's that area. So David goes up to him and says, let me into the city. That's kind of how he first starts. You don't need to have a big fight, but I'm going to take your city. And they tell him, not even the lame and blind could take the city, so you're not going to get in. Go away. Now David's angry, because again, we have people that are denying him what should be his, what is given to him by God. So he begins to prepare for battle. And as they're looking at the city, there's no real good way in except the well underneath. If you can get inside through the waterways, you can come up inside the city and don't even have to fight at the walls. So David gets together his army and they take over the city of Jerusalem. Real easy. And he tells them, we're going to go in there and we're going to kill the lame and blind who are my enemies. So he basically tells them, they're evil. We're going to go get them. Let's go, guys. They all get together and they take the city of Jerusalem. And David then makes it his capital. And whenever he does this, he begins to expand the kingdom of Israel now, because he has a capital city. And for many years, he fights a series of wars with all of their neighboring nations. If you look at chapter 8, verses 1 through 14, it lists off all the people he fought. And I'm not going to read through that whole list, but it's there if you want it. If you look at your map too, a lot of those nations you see are the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Armenians. All these nations all around Israel, he fights, he subjugates, and they become his client states, meaning they send him a portion of their money every month or whatever as a way to pay tribute to David. Because he is a great king anointed by God, he does great things for the people. And while he's fighting these wars, he does another great thing. It's something that we talked about. Remember, who remembers where the Ark of the Covenant is? It's in a barn. It's in a barn because it had been gone since Shiloh was destroyed way back in the book of Judges. So the Ark of the Covenant isn't at the tabernacle, but now David wants to return it to Jerusalem where it should be. And we start to read this story in 2 Samuel chapter 6. David returns the Ark of the Covenant where it should be. And as he does this, he asks people, where's the Ark? We know it's somewhere in Israel, but where is it? They find it at the house of Abinadab and go out to get it. And I love it too. Here we see even David, man after God's own heart, doesn't quite know what to do with the Ark of the Covenant. Because they get it and it says they build a new cart, they put an ox on the cart, and they load the Ark of the Covenant onto a cart to wheel it into Jerusalem. And as they're doing this, the story goes, they're wheeling this cart, and as they're wheeling it, the ox stumbles over a rock and kind of falls down. And one of the guys that's with them realizes the cart's leaning, I better grab the Ark of the Covenant to keep it from falling over. So he reaches out and he touches the Ark of the Covenant. And It says the Lord's anger burned against him and he struck him dead there on the spot. So now everybody's scared again because they haven't really seen God strike anybody down in a long time. This isn't something they're used to. And it says David, even David, is scared to bring it into the city because he thinks God is angry with him. He's scared to bring it in. He doesn't want Jerusalem to fall under the wrath of God because of what just happened. So they store it again at a farmer's house, and everyone goes home. And it says a few days go by, or a few weeks, some time passes, and the farmer is blessed over and over and over and over because of the Ark of the Covenant. And now David hears about this and is like, oh, God's not mad at us. We just need to be careful how we handle the Ark of the Covenant. So he again gets everyone together, and they take the Ark from the guy's house, and this time it looks like they're actually carrying it as you should be, with the 4 priests holding it on their shoulder. And they start to carry it into Jerusalem, and as they're carrying it in, David is dancing in front of everyone. It's a big party as they bring in the Ark of the Covenant, because this is a big deal. As we read about in the Epic of Eden, there are the people, God has his people, they're living in the place God wanted them to, they have the presence, and now they're going to be getting the person. Because all of this is coming together according to God's plan. Jerusalem is growing to be the spiritual and political capital of the nation. That is what is happening here. So as they're carrying in the Ark of the Covenant, David is full of the Spirit of the Lord, so excited to be doing what God wants him to do, to have the Lord's presence coming in and put back where it should be. He doesn't care who sees him almost look like an idiot. That's what he kind of looked like as he was dancing. But he didn't care. As he was dancing, everyone was looking at the king, who was supposed to be this regal figure, celebrating like some partier. That's what he looked like, dancing as they went. And as we look at this story, as he's dancing, his wife McCall sees what he's doing. And she sits up and looks at him dance. She despises him for it. She hates him because of how he's looking. He's not looking like a king. He's dancing in front of all these women. All the slave girls are watching the king, who, as we know, is a pretty good-looking guy. It says that. David was a pretty handsome guy, looking like a fool, dancing in front of everyone. That's not what a king looks like. She's angry about it. And later, after he gets the ark put in the tabernacle, put inside, the city gets, all these blessings start to happen, he goes home. And whenever he gets home, his wife confronts him, says, you're out there, you're dancing you're dancing for all these girls that are watching. You don't care about me. It's kind of that thing she has, is you're just dancing because of all the people looking around. And he rebukes her for it because he's so happy, he doesn't care who sees him. He's so pleased and happy to be in the presence of God, to have God with him. He doesn't care who sees him. But that's not what she thought. And because of this, it says she never bears children. She never gives birth to any of David's kids because of her heart. Again, we see the difference of the hearts. Betty? Mm-hmm. Naked. Yeah. So we don't know exactly which it was, but I can imagine the linen ephod. He was wearing some clothes, but the way he was dancing, he might as well have been naked. That's kind of what she's at. He might as well have just been walking down the street completely naked. That's what it looked like to her. And he's angry about this because he's so full of the Spirit of the Lord. He says, how could you say that? Do you not understand what's going on? And she gets rebuked for this and becomes barren because of it. Because she doesn't understand the idea of having the Ark of the Covenant, the promised presence of God, back where it should be. David restores this at this point. He restores the presence of the Lord where it ought to be. Right back into the center of Jerusalem, where it needs to be, in the tabernacle, where God can bless Jerusalem. And that's what happens. God's presence fills the place, and everything is going wonderful for David. And then we see the list of his conquests, all the nations he subjugates. And about the end of that time, somewhere in there, David is sitting in his palace, and it's 2 Samuel chapter 9. He's sitting in his palace. So I'm going to read the first 7 verses. David asks, "Is there anyone left of the house of Saul whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" So even now, it's been a few years since all of this has happened. He still remembers Jonathan, the man who saved his life many times, his best friend, his brother-in-law. He remembers Saul, the anointed king, and still wants to honor their memory. For Jonathan's sake, he wants to find somebody. It says, "Now there was a servant of Saul's house named Ziba. They called him to appear before the king, and he said, 'Are you Ziba, your servant?' And he says, 'Yes.' Then the king asks them, 'Is there anyone left of the house of Saul whom I can show God's kindness to?' It says, 'There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in both feet.' 'Where is he?' the king asks. 'He's at the house of Machir the Amel in Lo-debar.' So King David had him brought from there. And when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed him to pay honor. And he asked him if that was his name. He says, 'Yes.' He says, 'Don't be afraid, for surely I will show kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore all your land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table.'" So this is one of Jonathan's children, and whenever you read about him, the reason he was crippled is when the Philistines were destroying all of Israel after Saul's death. They went to save the boy, and as they ran, the person carrying him tripped, and something happened. It broke the guy's legs. We don't know exactly what happened, but for whatever reason, whenever they fell, he was crippled. And now, David, the new king, this is an important thing, ought to be looking to kill all the descendants of Saul. Because then if you know anything about how the kings work, the king, then his son becomes king, then the son of the son becomes king. It's a lineage of bloodlines. And usually, if a king kills another king and takes over, that person's children or grandchildren will grow up and try to retake the kingdom. But that's not what David does here. Because of his love for Jonathan and his love for Saul, he finds one of their descendants, brings him before him and says, "I'm not just going to let you live in my house and eat at my table. I'm going to restore all the land that was your grandfather's." So this boy, this guy, he gets not only to eat and live in David's household the rest of his life, he gets all his servants back. He gets all the land that was owned by Saul. He gets everything. Everything just short of becoming king, pretty much, is what this guy gets. And it's a showing David's mercy and kindness for what has happened in his life. Again, we see, we're going to keep seeing this through the life of David, a contrast to Saul. Saul, who was always fearful, who tried to kill David out of fear because he knew David was going to be king. David isn't scared of Saul's descendant. He doesn't think he's going to want to be king one day. Instead, he says, "No, this person is Jonathan's son. I want to show the kindness of God to him." And he restores him to where he needs to be. It's a wonderful act of mercy and kindness on David's part. Again, contrasted to how Saul acted. And as we end this morning, we end in chapter 10, which is one of the last stories we're going to see, well, not the last one, but one of them, of David conquering neighboring nations. Because at this one, there was the king of the Ammonites. And if we remember, when David was on the run, this king gave David shelter for a few months. He let David leave his family with him while he went out to go be on the run from Saul. So this king was kind to David when David needed kindness. So now that king dies and his son takes over. And David says to himself, "All right, I'm going to show this person the same kindness his father showed me." So it says he gets together some people in a caravan to go give him some gold, to go show reverence, and to pretty much greet him as like, "Hey, one king to another, how you doing?" Just a nice, general, friendly greeting. But as these Jewish people, they get to the town, the capital city, They get brought before the king, and the king thinks this is a trick. They're spies sent to spy on us so David can come conquer my kingdom. So he says he gets mad, he beats them, and he shaves half their beard off, which is a sign of disrespect in that day. Because for the Jewish people, you grow the beard. Your facial hair, it's an important thing. It's part of showing who you are. Well, they get half of it shaved off. And then they get sent back to David, disgraced, beaten, and rejected. So these people are coming back, and David hears what has happened to them, and he tells them, wait in Jericho for your beards to grow back before you come home. That way you don't get dishonored in front of everybody. That's what David tells them. It's like, just wait, come home in a few months when your beard grows in, everything will be fine, I'm going to take care of it. So this is the last time one of the last times we see David conquer, because now, after trying to do something nice, he gets rejected. David goes into war mode. So David gets together his army and they march, and this is one of the last kingdoms that they subjugate because of this. David was trying to be nice, trying to do the right thing, to show kindness because kindness was shown to him. It was rejected, so he goes to war against the Ammonites. It says, the title of this section is David Defeats the Ammonites. And as they were going to war, the Ammonites didn't want to fight their own battle. It's a hilarious story here because we see the Lord defending David. Because the Ammonites, they knew they could take him. They had a really large army. But it says they hire out some Armenian mercenaries, pretty much. They say, hey, we're going to hire you. Come help us fight our battle. Kind of like what Russia did in the war with Ukraine, where they're hiring out mercenaries. That's what this kingdom is doing. They're hiring in some people to help them fight their battle. The armies of Israel get there, and the long and short of it is they're outnumbered a whole lot, but God's with the Israelites, and they beat back this army. And it says they beat them so badly, not only do they defeat the Ammonites and subjugate them, but the armies they hired, the people group they hired, are too scared to ever fight against the armies of Israel again, at least for the life of David. This victory David does, again, just shows the power of the Lord when he was with them. Because the Lord was with David, and David won these great victories. Now, next week, we're going to see, I don't remember who saw it. Let me draw it up here real quick. We're going to see David's life take the turn. Because every king, let me use the red, it'll probably show up better. Every king's life we've seen does this. Starts out normal, starts to go on the rise, gets to about here, and then just kind of downward spirals. Saul's was much quicker. David's is much bigger. Solomon's is pretty small too. But we've been looking at David on his rise. He's been doing great things, been a great king. Next week, we're going to see this turning point where everything starts to go downhill. It's a pretty gross story next week, so it's a parental advisory for children. It's not necessarily a child's story from here on out. Yes, that's what I'm going to be closing with here. So now, the fifth covenant is what we see in chapter 7. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read it. This was God's covenant. Because now we have the person. We had the place. We had the people. We've had the presence. Now we're going to get the person. And this is what the Lord's covenant was with David. It starts in chapter 7, verse 5. The Lord comes to Nathan the prophet and he says, "Go tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house since the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place, and a tent is my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say anything of their rulers whom I commanded to be shepherds of my people? Why have you not built me a house of cedar? Then tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flocks to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great like the names of the greatest men on earth. I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they have a home for their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did in the beginning, and I have done everything since the time I appointed their leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you a rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body. I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with flogging inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. That is God's covenant. And in that, there are some aspects that point to Jonathan, because the person building the house, or Solomon, my bad, wrong son. Solomon, who builds the first temple. But the bigger promise there is the promise of a descendant whose kingdom will be forever, that is Jesus. So even now, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we're seeing what we're going to see in Matthew 1. Remember that genealogy that we sometimes read over quickly because we can't pronounce the names? Well, what that genealogy does is show God's final fifth covenant to David, saying, your son will reign forever. It's a promised person to bring about the redemption of not only Israel, but the whole world. Now, a lot has been said here with history and connecting some of the Old Testament to some of the New Testament. But if I can leave you with one thing today before I close up in a word of prayer, I want to leave you with this. Going back to when David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and he danced as though he was naked in front of everyone to see, the reason he did that was because of how much he loved God and how in tune he was with the Spirit. He did not care who was looking. He just wanted to worship God. The question is, how many of us, when was the last time we didn't care what people saw when they looked at us? We just wanted to please God. Because I know there's a lot of times in my life I think, man, I should help out, but I really don't, or I should pray for them, but I really don't want to because I don't want everyone looking at me. Or, even just simple things like out to eat. Man, I should pray before I eat, but I don't want anyone to judge me. That happens a lot with us as Christians. But really, we need to be like David, who didn't care who was watching. He just wanted to please God. And how we do that is finding our own ways to stay in touch with the Spirit. And it's different for each and every one of us. We all have different ways of doing it. I know for Dad, I was talking to him about this. His is listening to a good sermon. When he listens to a good sermon, it just fills him with the Spirit, and he's just doesn't care who sees. He's excited to just talk about God and Jesus and to minister and to obey God. For Mom, a lot of times, it's just relaxing in the pool listening to Joy FM. That's what it is. Am I wrong, Mom? That's one of those things that just fill her and remind her of the presence of God, and she doesn't care who sees her. She's worshiping God. For me, I found one for me this week. I've been at camp. I've had a lot of time where I was just sitting on a bench looking at nature and then going into worship. And I'll tell you what, I worshiped a lot harder after doing that than I ever have before. It's because those times when I sat and just in nature and just kind of meditated, sounds weird, but just meditated and was with God, it filled me with that. It reminded me that I don't need to care what other people think. I just need to follow God. And that's what I want to leave you with from this is we're not just looking at this for history. That is very important because I view this history as my history because this is a history of God. But there's also things we pull out of this, and that is we need to not care so much what other people think when they look at us. Find ways to keep yourself in touch with God, whether it's through reading the Bible, sitting outside, listening to worship music, praying, whatever it is. Because when you're filled with that, you'll be able to minister to everyone around you in miraculous ways. I'm going to go ahead and close this with a word of prayer. And then next week, we're going to start in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Oh, questions before I pray? What? All right, I'll pray and then we'll go over the answers to the blanks. Dear God, I thank you for today that we're able to get together and just look at your word, see the history, and just pull out some application for us. Be with us this week and help us find our ways to just stay in touch with you, to honor you and follow you in whatever ways we can. In your name I pray, amen. All right, the blanks. Which ones? People, place, presence, person. Sorry, I got to talking. You can call me.
Already had it. No.
Yeah. I'm John's son. Blanks I love because they're helpful for remembering, but I have a hard time going over them because I start talking.
What is this question?
People, place, presence. Setting it up as the spiritual and political.
Oh, can you write it down?
Yeah, I gotcha.